He came to New York as a teenage musician, with little more than his guitar and his ambition. By the middle of the 1960s, he had become the voice of a generation. Today, we're looking at the poet who dominated folk rock in the 60s. Robert Allen Zimmerman was born in Hibbing, Minnesota in 1941. His early years were spent in a small mining town where music wasn't exactly a central part of the community's identity. However, something in that remote Minnesota landscape inspired the young Zimmerman to pick up a guitar and begin teaching himself the instrument. He was drawn to folk music, to country music, to the blues. He listened to everything he could find, absorbing influences from artists who came before him. By his teenage years, Zimmerman was performing in local bands and at school events. He was restless, though, with an undefined hunger to do something significant with music. The small town of Hibbing, despite its charm and community character, felt limiting to an ambitious young musician. He knew he needed to get to a place where serious musicians gathered, where real opportunities existed. That place, in his mind, was New York City, where the folk music scene was beginning to flourish.
But the poor white man's used in the hands of them all like...
When Zimmerman arrived in New York City in 1961, he was just 19 years old. He legally changed his name to Bob Dylan, inspired by the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, and by the sense that a new name represented a new beginning. The folk music scene in New York was vibrant and growing. Coffee houses and folk clubs throughout Greenwich Village hosted performances nightly. Young musicians gathered to share music, to learn from each other, and to perform for audiences hungry for authentic folk music. Dylan quickly became a regular in these venues. He performed at clubs like Goethe's Folk City and the Café Wah. He was developing his craft, learning songs, and beginning to write his own material. The folk scene was welcoming to young talent, and Dylan's distinctive voice and his growing collection of original songs began to attract attention. Other folk musicians recognized something special in him. He was not just technically proficient, though he was working constantly to improve his skills. He had something else, something that transcended technique. He had an emotional depth and a lyrical sensibility that set him apart. In 1962, Dylan released his first album, simply titled Bob Dylan. It was a modest beginning, recorded quickly and featuring primarily traditional folk songs with a handful of original compositions. The album did not sell in large numbers initially, but it established him as a recording artist and caught the attention of people who were paying attention to what was happening in folk music. His second album, released in 1963, marked a significant shift. By this time, Dylan was writing more original material, and his lyrics were beginning to reflect growing social and political consciousness. The early 1960s were a time of tremendous social upheaval in America. The civil rights movement was accelerating. Questions about war and peace were becoming increasingly urgent. Young people, particularly those involved in the folk music scene, were thinking seriously about how their music could address these concerns. Dylan, with his gift for lyrical expression and his growing understanding of folk music as a vehicle for social commentary, began writing songs that spoke directly to these issues. His songs from this period addressed injustice, inequality, and the suffering of ordinary people. They reflected the concerns that were animating the younger generation. What made Dylan's approach distinctive was that he wasn't writing propaganda or simple slogans. He was writing complex, poetic lyrics that conveyed moral seriousness without being preachy or obvious. His words had weight and gravity. They demanded to be taken seriously. In 1963, Dylan performed at the Newport Folk Festival, one of the most prestigious folk music events in the country. His performance caught the attention of national media. Here was a young man with something important to say, and he was saying it through songs that resonated with audiences. The folk music world was beginning to recognize him as something more than just another promising young performer. He was becoming an artist of real significance. By 1964, Dylan's third album had been released and was gaining significant attention. That same year, he was invited to perform on television, reaching millions of people. The impact was immediate. Young people across the country were hearing his music and responding to the messages in his songs. He was speaking to the concerns of a generation. Parents and establishment figures were sometimes uncomfortable with his message, but that very discomfort made him more appealing to younger audiences who felt alienated from the mainstream. Dylan's lyrics during this period addressed poverty, injustice, and the moral failures of society. They also spoke to personal themes of love, loss, and confusion. What was remarkable was how he could move between these different registers, sometimes in the same song. He was a poet first and foremost, and his mastery of language and imagery was undeniable. He could pack tremendous meaning into relatively few words. His songs rewarded careful listening and repeated exposure. The moment that perhaps most defined Dylan's career, at least in terms of generating intense reaction, came at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. Dylan took the stage with electric instruments rather than the acoustic guitar that had become his trademark. To many in the folk music community, this felt like a betrayal. Folk music was supposed to be acoustic, authentic, rooted in tradition. Electric instruments represented commercialism and compromises. However, from Dylan's perspective, the music simply required these instruments to express what he wanted to express. The electric sound allowed for a different kind of energy and emotional intensity. His lyrics were not changing. His commitment to meaningful subject matter was not wavering. What was changing was the musical framework through which these songs were being presented. For some, this was a legitimate artistic evolution. For others, it felt like a fundamental violation of folk music principles. This moment revealed something important about Dylan. He was not willing to be confined by anyone's expectations about what kind of artist he should be. The folk community wanted him to remain a folk musician. The music industry might have wanted him to become a pop star. Dylan wanted to do what he felt was artistically necessary. That stubborn independence and commitment to artistic integrity would characterize his entire career. Between 1965 and 1966, Dylan recorded 3 albums that many consider among the greatest albums in the history of rock and popular music. These albums featured some of his most distinctive and powerful songs. Songs like a Rolling Stone, recorded in 1965, became iconic. This song, with its distinctive harmonica riff and its devastating lyrics, became a statement of defiance and change. It was about transformation and the consequences of life's turns. The song was over 6 minutes long, exceptionally long for a pop or rock song at the time. It demonstrated that Dylan had no interest in conforming to commercial radio formats. He was going to write and record what he felt needed to be written and recorded. Other songs from this period, including Ballad of a Thin Man, Rainy Day Women, Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and Temporary Like Achilles, showcased Dylan's expanding range as a songwriter and performer. He was writing about corruption, about social decay, about personal relationships, about the experience of being an outsider observing society. His lyrics often contained layers of meaning. They invited interpretation and discussion. They were not always immediately obvious or easily understood, which meant people returned to them again and again, discovering new meanings each time. Dylan was also experimenting with different musical styles and approaches. Some songs were fast and aggressive. Others were slow and meditative. Some featured extensive musical arrangements with multiple instruments and vocals. Others were stark and minimal. What connected all of this work was Dylan's vocal performance and his lyrical gifts. His voice was distinctive, sometimes difficult to listen to if you weren't accustomed to it, but absolutely compelling. It conveyed emotion and meaning through its very texture and quality. By the late 1960s, Dylan had become more than just a folk musician or even a rock musician. He was a cultural figure of immense significance. Young people looked to him not just for entertainment, but for perspective on the world. His songs were played at protests. They were heard at gatherings of young people trying to figure out what they believed and what kind of world they wanted to create. He had become, whether he wanted to be or not, a spokesman for his generation. However, it's important to understand that Dylan was often uncomfortable with this role. He didn't position himself as a prophet or a guru. He was a songwriter and a performer, not a political leader or activist. He had written songs that addressed political and social issues, but he resisted being reduced to that single dimension of his work. His songs were about many things. They were about personal relationships and emotions. They were about confusion and uncertainty. They were not always clear moral statements or calls to action. They were often questions, explorations, attempts to understand complexity. This tension between the way people wanted to use Dylan and what he actually was trying to do would remain a feature of his career. He would continue to evolve, to surprise people, to resist easy categorization. Some people would appreciate this evolution and the refusal to be trapped in any single artistic lane. Others would feel betrayed by his changes, particularly when his work seemed to move away from overt political engagement. Dylan's influence on rock and popular music cannot be overstated. He demonstrated that rock music could contain complex literary lyrics. He showed that popular music could address serious subjects without becoming propaganda or losing its artistic quality. He proved that a solo performer with a guitar and harmonica could stand against the professional musicians and elaborate arrangements of established performers and hold the attention of millions. Other musicians looked at what Dylan was doing and were inspired to expand their own possibilities. Songwriters began to take their craft more seriously, recognizing that the words mattered just as much as the music. Artists began to feel that they had freedom to evolve and change their sound, to experiment with different genres and approaches. Dylan opened doors that others could walk through. The music industry itself changed partly because of Dylan's success and influence. Record companies became more willing to take risks on artists who had something different to say. Folk clubs gave way to rock venues. The line between folk and rock began to blur and eventually disappeared. By the end of the 1960s, many of the distinctions that had seemed important earlier in the decade were no longer meaningful. Music had evolved, and Dylan was one of the primary catalysts for that evolution. While this discussion is focused on the 1960s and Dylan's dominance of folk rock during that era, it's important to recognize that his career extended far beyond that decade. After the 1960s, Dylan recorded through the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and into the 21st century. He continued to produce albums regularly, and while not every album was universally acclaimed, many contained songs of genuine significance and artistry. Throughout the 1970s, Dylan moved between different musical styles, sometimes returning to more acoustic, folk-influenced arrangements, sometimes embracing rock and roll completely, sometimes incorporating country music elements. In the 1980s and 1990s, Dylan participated in various collaborations and tribute concerts. Other artists sought him out because his influence was so pervasive. Younger musicians who had grown up listening to Dylan wanted to work with him, to benefit from his experience and insights. He became not just an active artist, but an elder statesman of rock and popular music. He toured consistently throughout these decades, performing old songs from the 1960s alongside newer material. These tours allowed new audiences to discover his music, while giving longtime fans opportunities to see him perform live. What was remarkable about Dylan in his later decades was his refusal to become a museum piece, performing his greatest hits from the past. He continued to write new material, continued to challenge himself and audiences, continued to evolve. Some of his later albums received critical acclaim on par with his 1960s work. Others were more uneven. But throughout, Dylan maintained the artistic integrity that had always characterized his work. He would not compromise artistically for commercial success. In 2016, Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. This recognition was significant because it officially acknowledged what had long been apparent to serious students of literature and music. Dylan was a poet of the highest caliber. His lyrics had literary merit that transcended their musical context. The decision was somewhat controversial. Some argued that literature prizes should go to poets who worked in traditional written forms. However, the Swedish Academy recognized that Dylan's work in song represented a form of literature that was significant and worthy of recognition. Dylan's acceptance of the Nobel Prize was characteristically understated. He didn't attend the ceremony in person, instead sending someone to read his statement on his behalf. In his remarks, he referenced Homer, Melville, and other great writers, acknowledging that he was working in a literary tradition that extended back through centuries of storytelling and poetry. He didn't position himself as something entirely new, but as someone working within an ancient tradition of poets using language to explore human experience. Over the course of his career, Dylan would record hundreds of songs. Some would be regarded as masterpieces that rank among the greatest songs ever written. Others would be less successful, interesting perhaps to devoted fans, but not achieving the cultural significance of his most famous work. Some periods would be regarded as more creative or inspired than others. But throughout his career, what remained consistent was his commitment to his craft, his refusal to repeat himself, and his belief that an artist should have the freedom to evolve and change. He never allowed himself to be trapped by expectations about what kind of artist he should be. The folk rock movement that Dylan helped define in the 1960s did not last forever in its pure form. By the 1970s, music had evolved in many different directions. Rock music became more diverse, fragmenting into numerous subgenres and styles. Folk music found new venues and audiences, sometimes disappearing from mainstream attention, sometimes re-emerging in modified forms. But the impact of folk rock and Dylan's role in shaping it remained profoundly significant. The idea that rock music could be serious, that it could contain meaningful lyrics addressing important subjects, that it could be both commercially successful and artistically significant became permanently embedded in popular culture. The influence of Dylan and the folk rock movement he helped pioneer can be seen in countless artists who came after him. The Beatles, who were primarily a rock and roll band, were influenced by Dylan's approach to songwriting and his willingness to address serious themes in their music. They began incorporating more complex lyrics and more sophisticated musical arrangements after being exposed to Dylan's work. Artists like the Byrds took Dylan's songs and transformed them into rock arrangements, introducing his work to audiences who might not have connected with the acoustic folk version. The Byrds' recording of Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man brought his songwriting to a broader audience while introducing him to the possibilities of electric rock production. Songwriters in subsequent decades would work with the expanded possibilities that Dylan had opened up. Joni Mitchell wrote complex, poetic lyrics that addressed both personal and social themes. Bruce Springsteen addressed working-class experience and American history through rock and roll, demonstrating that popular music could contain serious social commentary. Leonard Cohen, who came to music from a background in poetry, found validation and precedent in Dylan's example of a poet working in musical form. Tom Waits developed a distinctive artistic voice that paid little attention to commercial considerations, following the example Dylan had set of prioritizing artistic integrity over commercial success. The boundaries between different musical genres became more permeable, partly because Dylan and others influenced by him had shown that such boundaries were artificial constraints. Music became a vehicle through which ideas were discussed, complex emotions were explored, and serious commentary on society was offered. Rock concerts became venues where political and social messages were conveyed. Musicians saw themselves not just as entertainers, but as artists with something important to say. The impact extended beyond music into the broader culture. Young people who grew up listening to Dylan developed a certain expectation of what popular music could be. They expected artists to have something to say, to address real issues, to demonstrate artistic growth and evolution. When artists failed to meet these expectations, they were criticized for selling out or for being artistically stagnant. Dylan had established a model of what an artist could be, and many subsequent artists were measured against that model. The folk rock era of the 1960s also represented a moment when popular music and serious art were not separated by an unbridgeable gulf. There was a sense that music could matter in important ways, that it could change people's thinking, that it could inspire action and engagement with the world. This belief extended beyond music to other art forms. The idea that popular culture could be serious culture became more accepted. Television, film, and other popular forms began to address serious themes and to be taken seriously by critics and audiences. Dylan's specific contribution to this cultural shift cannot be overstated. He had demonstrated through his own example that popular success was not incompatible with artistic seriousness, that a performer could address complex themes, could use language with precision and care, could evolve and change as an artist, and could still reach millions of people. He had shown that audiences wanted this kind of art, that they would respond to challenging and meaningful material, if it was presented with authenticity and artistry. The poet who dominated folk rock in the 1960s remains one of the most significant figures in the history of popular music. Bob Dylan's influence extends far beyond his own recordings. He changed what was possible in popular music. He showed that songs could be poetry, that musicians could be intellectuals, that rock and roll could contain serious art. The songs he wrote during the 1960s continue to be performed, listened to, and studied decades later. They remain relevant not just as historical documents, but as works of art that continue to speak to listeners. If you've enjoyed learning about this transformative period in music history and the artist who defined it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of music legends and the eras they shaped. Thank you for watching.